Today, we're so used to plates and screws and other forms of fixation using various types of dental compounds that we forget how much we can accomplish using just a spool of wire. In the Great Wars, Kazanjian showed how much can be accomplished with only a spool of wire. His textbooks of converse are classics. Many of the techniques that were established a century ago are still worth keeping in our armamentarium. In fact, there's nothing terribly new or exciting in this module other than to remind us of the most basic form of fixation. The wire can be found in any operating room and in any MASH unit. Wherever there's a conflict, you can find wire. I like to break down the maxillofacial fractures into two basic and broad categories. Fractures that don't involve teeth. In these cases, you just put the pieces back. No teeth to worry about, no TMJ to think about. But the second category is those that involve the teeth and thus have a joint, and then there's motion to deal with. These are more interesting and more complicated. Then, of course, you have even the more challenging cases, the ones without teeth and involve a denture. So in this module, we will focus on how we can use wires to manage dental-alveolar fractures, or in procedural billing terminology, the CPT code 21445. If you only have a single tooth, there is no solution. The tooth is unlikely to survive. Your goal is to stabilize the mandibular base fracture. If you have two teeth, now you have an option. You can buddy tape it. How do you buddy tape teeth? This basic technique is described as the Ernst ligature. You pass the wire between the teeth, then loop that wire from distal to mesial. Key is going above the interdental wire, then pass that wire from lingual to buccal between the teeth, again above the loop of wire. This then traps the loop of wire. This way, as you twist clockwise, you cinch the wire circumferentially around the neck or the cingulum of each tooth. When you have more than a tooth on either side of the fracture, then you can modify the Ernst to my favorite, which is a bridle wire technique. In this case, you loop a long piece of wire, a minimum of two teeth on either side of the fracture. You always tie down or twist the main loop of wire mesial to make it easier at the end. Remember not to fully cinch it down. You need to leave some slack. Next, you then pass a wire between the teeth, always going from buccal to lingual below the main loop, and then pass that same wire from lingual to buccal above the main loop. Then as you twist clockwise the interdental wire down, it will cinch the main loop circumferentially around the cingulum of the tooth. Use a ligature director to control the wire by pushing below the neck of the teeth as you cinch the wire. Then you repeat this. Again, the interdental wire goes below the main loop and then returns out above the main loop. It is important that you go from distal to mesial so that the slack in the main loop is removed sequentially. As you go from distal to medial, you may need to loosen the main loop to allow more wire length for each tooth. Finally, you cinch down the main loop, then at the end rosette each of the interdental wires clockwise toward the crowns. I've used this for the past 3 decades. It has always worked well. Once you have the skeletal fixation with plates and screws and a combination with the bridle wire, none of our patients are in post-op maxillomandibular fixation. Discharge on mechanically soft diet. The wires are removed at 6 to 8 weeks or whenever our patients remember to show up. Sometimes they do come back with another new mandible fracture in a different location. The next section is coordinating upper and lower dental arches, what is commonly called maxillomandibular interdental fixation, the MMF. If you leave the strands long enough on an Ernst wire ligature, you can simply twist them together during the case to put the patient in MMF. You first make an IV loop and eyelet by putting a few twists in a folded wire. Then you pass the two tails between the teeth. The distal tail is then brought around distally. Then the other tail, the proximal tail, is brought out mesially. Then the distal tail is brought through the eyelet, that is the IV loop. And then the main loop wire is twisted down first. Once that's done, then the eyelet, the IV loop, is twisted down to secure the wire circumferentially below the cingulum. Technically, the IV loop is more difficult to look elegant than the Ernst ligature. However, the IV loop has the advantage over the Ernst because you can place the patient in maxillomandibular fixation by passing a separate wire through the IV loops, and then the separate wire can be removed easily in the post-op period. My favorite is the Schubert MMF. If all you need is maxillomandibular fixation in the case and not post-op, then this is the fastest approach. You use a large gauge wire like a 23 or 24 gauge wire, large enough of a diameter so that it's tight in the embrasure between the teeth. I typically pass a wire between the first and second premolar or between the second premolar and first molar. It's a single loop of wire on either side. Then you twist the tails of the loop to put the patient in MMF. Try pulling apart the typodont in the lab. When you do this, you'll find this surprisingly quite secure with only 2 wires. Arch bars can be used for dental-alveolar fractures and for maxillomandibular fixation. But in our practice, we don't bother with Eric or any other forms of arch bars. We removed them from our trays about a quarter of a century ago. That's why I can't show you a video because we don't have any. You just need to know that they exist. You'll do it in the lab and rarely if ever again. The simple wire fixation techniques achieve the task at hand, are much faster, more comfortable not only for the patient, but also the surgeon. For those of you who feel you need such things, use the bone-based arch bars and don't worry about the expense. If the hospital complains, tell the bean counters it'll cost them more when the wire penetrates through the surgeon's finger. So enough said about arch bars. This is a good solution if you're lucky to have the materials on hand in the OR. These are dental compounds that can be molded and then made solid by UV light polymerization. You can make occlusal and reinforcing splints and then wire the splint into position. A good example is a palatal fracture. You can make this in situ in the operating field. You can find these in any dental catalogs, and you can even get it overnight from Amazon. To summarize, there are 3 basic techniques. There's interdental fixation for dental alveolar fractures, for which you can use a wire. There's intermaxillary mandibular fracture, for which you can use a wire. And then there's bone fixation, for which you use plates and screws. It's useful to know the diameter of the wire and what the OR has. We prefer the 23 gauge wire because it's easier to handle and pierce the interdental spaces. When the wires are thinner, it just simply bends. The thicker gauge acts as a needle to help pass between the teeth. It also happens to be the only size wire our level 1 trauma has. Today, most hospitals buy straight wire and not spools because the spool gets contaminated and it's difficult to re-sterilize. The problem is that sterile processing will take a nice straight wire and package it for sterilization. Your surgical tech then opens the package and presents you with a sterile but bent wire. So what you tell the scrub nurse or the resident is to straighten the wire by putting the wire in tension between bulldog wire holders and stretching it until plastic deformation. That is because all the wires have elasticity and the heat from the sterilization weakens the wire. If you don't stretch the wire before, you'll find at the post-op appointment that the wire has loosened and you'll need to retighten it. And this is because of the elasticity in the wire. By stretching it, you will not regain the elastic recoil, and once the strain is removed, at the yield point, the wire is stronger. So here's some basic principles when working with wires. Always stretch the wire to remove any residual strain so you get it close to the yield point. Apply continuous tension on the wire while twisting or tightening. The force should always be applied apically while tightening. Twist clockwise direction for all tightening and then counterclockwise to untwist. Only half a turn to be given at the time at the end before the secondary twisting occurs. Look for a change in color to a dull gray. And then twist always at the end of a fixed point and not in the middle. So what can you do with a spool of wire? You can do a lot with just wire. Always keep a few spools in the glove compartment of your car along with some steri strips for when you fall off that ladder. Thank you.